Hey everyone, thank you for coming to our panel on reclaiming our shared narrative. I think we can all relate to the benefits of technology, particularly given the format of today's presentation. But even outside of the pandemic, Google can finish our sentences and even find topics we didn't know we were interested in. We get reminders of our partner's birthday, and if you don't have a partner, it'll introduce you to an endless supply of singles near you. We even have access to this magical device that plays whatever song pops into our head. But have we turned the volume up on everything a bit too loud? Today, we are going to be speaking to Nirial, best-selling author of Hooked and Indistractable, Melissa O'Donnell, human rights lawyer and co-founder of Thinkers, and Seth Gentle, CTO of Prismatic and ex-Google developer. So Seth, from the perspective of a technologist, what do you think is the problem with the tech industry?
Sure, thanks for asking. The way that I see it is that with the invent of the internet, we've invented this new space. It's like we've discovered a new country and we've gone there, which is extremely exciting. We've got new ways to communicate. We've got new opportunities to be able to connect with each other. But the problem is that we haven't realized that we need to bring governance along with it. So we've gotten advertising companies to pay for all of the infrastructure, and then in exchange, they're trying to addict us as much as they possibly can to constant sources of information, to Twitter, to Facebook news feeds that show people conspiracy theories, to YouTube, to we've got 4chan convincing people to go and shoot up a mosque in Christchurch. And all of these problems come from the fact that this new space that we've created, this space doesn't have any civil rules of engagement. It doesn't have any governance. We have no authority or autonomy as individuals in this new space that we've made, and we really need to step up as adults and start inventing the future and inventing the place that we've created.
Right. So, Nir, your book Hooked is the playbook on creating habit-forming products. How does your knowledge of the topic influence the way you see the problem?
So, thanks for having me. First of all, I think I'd love to answer the question, but also to kind of reference what Joseph just said in terms of agency and autonomy and addiction. And these are words that get thrown around a lot, but I think they really matter. The words we use have a huge impact on our behaviors. And I really take issue with this idea that we don't have agency, that technology is hijacking our brain, that it's addicting everyone. I think it's disrespectful to people who have the pathology of addiction, a real addiction, a persistent dependency on a behavior or substance, versus what for the vast majority of people is not an addiction and should not be called as such. It is a distraction at worst. The vast majority of people, just like with alcohol, which is highly addictive, just because someone has a pint with dinner doesn't mean that they are an alcoholic. It's a very small percentage of people who are addicted to alcohol, just as a very small percentage of people are actually addicted to technology. But of course, we love that narrative. We want to think that it's hijacking our brains, and there's nothing we can do about it, because if it's addicting us and we're powerless and we lack agency, well, then it's not my problem. Let's let the legislators fix it. Let's let big tech fix it. And to that I say, if you hold your breath waiting for big tech or big government to fix the problem, you're going to suffocate. So clearly there is room for legislation, but why would we wait? Why would we not do something right now? And it turns out it's actually not that hard. There are all kinds of things that we can do immediately to make sure that we get the best out of technology without letting it get the best of us.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to jump to an introduction with Melissa now, and then we can kind of circle back to those same questions. So, Melissa, you're working on a startup that's contextualizing news sources and revealing bias to users. What were the problems you were seeing which led you to the creation of Thinkers?
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me. I feel a little fish out of water in this space, but it's really nice to be on this panel with Steph and with Nia. What drew me in as someone that's never been in the tech space before is my work as a human rights lawyer and activist, and someone really engaged in narratives, challenging narratives. And, I do believe the answer does lie in some of our shared narrative. So I want to pick up a little bit on what Steph's saying and a little bit on what Nia's saying, but pull it back to the bigger picture and maybe say, when we're thinking about the solutions to this, what I really want to say is we need to make sure the right people are at the table. Everybody is at the table. And so this notion that we're reclaiming anything, I think, is actually a false idea. We've never had a shared narrative. There are lots of people who have never been at the table. And I mean, me on a personal level, I struggled with the idea that I'm sitting at a panel with an Israeli. My background and my deep personal connection is in Palestine, and I have family in the West Bank who have been imprisoned for their use of social media. So there's definitely personal issues going on with our use and our understanding of social media, but there is a very big picture that also needs to be regulated and understood. And when we're having these conversations, we need to be challenging ourselves at who is sitting at the table when we're coming up with these solutions. I mean, even myself, I feel like I shouldn't be the one having this conversation. It's all the communities and spaces, whether it's, I've been in East Timor, I've been in Palestine, I've been in Aboriginal communities in Australia. There's thinking there that can also provide the solution. And so what I see is going on is the problems we're coming to now are a little bit that discomfort because we're being challenged in what the power structures are. We're hearing narratives we've never heard before because they suddenly have access to us. And that's actually distressing when it confronts you directly and on a personal level. It's easier to accept when you're removed from it. So I would challenge us to sit in that discomfort of everything that we're hearing, the left, the right, how everyone's perceiving things, and embrace the complexity of that. And that's what we're trying to do at Thinkers is mix up individual responsibility. We're trying to provide a way for people themselves to take responsibility for critically thinking what they're absorbing, but also trying to provide that more systemic solution to a problem by questioning media, questioning news, and holding them accountable and saying, look, this might have this bias, or what about this narrative? You haven't heard this story. So I think it's a mix of what I'm hearing from everybody as the solution.
Right. So, kind of circling back to the addiction side that you were talking about, Nir, could you give us a brief explanation of what digital profiling is and why companies do it, and whether there's any benefits to this from a consumer perspective?
What do you mean by digital profiling?
As in companies collecting data about their users and personalizing content based on how they behave on a website or anything like that.
Yeah, so companies personalizing an experience for a consumer can be good and can be bad. I think the test that companies should use is some common sense around how we would want to interact with a good friend. In that, if you went out to lunch with a good friend and you had a great conversation and disclosed what was going on in your life and told them about your struggles and what you were facing in life, and then a few weeks later, you got together for lunch again, and you realize that your friend doesn't remember a thing you told them, well, that person wouldn't be a very good friend because they weren't listening to you. And you would either ask if they have amnesia or you would doubt your friendship. And I think there's something very similar going on with the way we interact with businesses and products and services we use. That customers tell us that they want to personalize experiences, they want products to improve with use, and I think it's a really missed opportunities for many companies when they don't learn from their customers. Now, there's a line we cross, and that line is very analogous to what happens in the real world, where if you met with that same friend and then you heard from another friend that they disclosed all this information to somebody else when you had entrusted that information just with that person, then of course that would be a breach of trust. This is what I call digital gossip. And just as gossiping in the real world is not a very positive trait and something we wouldn't want to do to our good friends, this is where consumers have a problem with data they give to companies. It's okay if it improves the product, if it's a one-to-one relationship with a company. Where people become very dissatisfied is when that data is leaked to third parties that they didn't authorize giving that information to.
But I want to jump in on that. So to me, that's not at all the problem. Like, yeah, sure. Like, absolutely, I agree that there's a problem of digital gossiping and companies talking about what I'm interested in buying. But the real problem to me, I mean, like, to go to your framing of like how you would interact as a good friend, if I have a good friend who's particularly prone to conspiracy style thinking, then I wouldn't show them videos convincing them that anti-vaxxers are correct, or that that the world is flat, or any of these other kinds of crazy thinking. This is exactly what YouTube does with people. YouTube will find that thing that will result in you clicking on the next video, and will show you a stream of videos that will take you down a rabbit hole towards, YouTube recommended Alex Jones, the guy who was saying that the families of people who got shot in the Sandy Hook massacre, that he was saying they were lying. They recommended his videos over 1 billion times to people. Like, this isn't the action of a good friend. This is the action of a pathological company that's trying everything they can to be able to find the videos that will keep us hooked, to use your book's name, keep us addicted, keep us coming back, keep us compulsively clicking on video and YouTube recommendations, which, I mean, maybe it's only a small percentage of the population, but I've certainly found myself down rabbit holes, an hour later clicking on the next video. Like, this stuff isn't healthy for society. This is pathological, and this is creating a society in which there's a growing number of people getting smallpox and the measles because their parents aren't vaccinating them. I think our society is being made worse by this technology.
First of all, I don't work for YouTube. As far as I'm concerned, everybody should, if you don't like YouTube, stop using YouTube. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I don't work for the company. I've never made a dollar on any interest with the company. So, if a product isn't serving you, I'm all for either moderating the use of the product or stopping the use of the product. That being said, I think, Seth, with all due respect, you're living in the past. YouTube has taken extensive steps over the past several years. That anti-vax stuff is old news. I mean, they've solved that problem a very long time ago. That is no longer the case. And I think this is the problem with the anti-tech rhetoric today, is that we've moved from skepticism, which is a very healthy trait, to now it's cynicism, right? There is nothing these companies can do right. We don't talk about how Facebook hired 35,000 content moderators. We don't talk about how they've banned political advertising on Twitter. We don't talk about all the stuff that YouTube is running around like crazy trying to figure out this very new problem. Look, Paul Virilio, the philosopher, said, when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. Any technology that has this type of world-changing impact is going to have shipwrecks. But just like with shipwrecks in the real world, when was the last time you heard about a shipwreck? It's pretty rare. It doesn't happen that much anymore. Why? Is it because we stopped sailing ships? No, we made ships better. We used one technology to improve the last generation of crappy technology. And that's exactly what's happening today. There are clearly problems caused by social media, but we have to also acknowledge that that same algorithm that you deride for spreading anti-vax information, which the problem has been largely taken care of, they have removed that content and they have technology now to keep up on that. That's the same kind of technology that my daughter uses to learn how to code. That's the same technology that recommends videos to my mom on how to do all kinds of interesting things. It's the same technology. When you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. There are problems, clearly, but we can't let our mind shift into this cynic perspective where the technology is terrible, it's hijacking your brain, there's nothing you can do about it. You know what I do about it? I installed a free Chrome extension called YouTube DF that every time I use YouTube, it automatically scrubs out all those suggested videos. So when I use YouTube, I only see the video I want to see. And guess what? There is nothing Google can do about it.
At the same time, like, I would challenge, on the one hand, Steph, I agree with Nia that there's those algorithms that send people down the wrong rabbit hole, and they continue. Like, okay, anti-vaxxer was an old thing that's been resolved. There'll be a new thing, and there are new things popping up that are really problematic. At the same time, those algorithms send you down the rabbit hole to get access to stories that you've never heard before, and people that haven't had their voice heard. And what I'd also then say is the solution that makes the individual able to cultivate completely what they want to see is also problematic, because that's actually then shutting out and undoing exactly what tech and social media provided us with access to. Because I know that those rabbit holes and switching off the suggested videos also means that you don't get things that pop up that you would never go looking for. And so that's also problematic. And so in terms of a solution, I think it is going to have to be, we want simplicity. We all want simplicity in our lives. I think when we're talking about reclaiming, we're talking about going back to something that was just a simpler way of being. We now have so much information at the tip of at the click of a button at our fingertips, and that's overwhelming. But actually, what might be more a solution is figuring out as a culture, as a society, as a collective, how to sit in that complexity. And that thinking is radically anti-Western. It's not how we think. We want things to be simple, and they're actually complex. And I'm going to borrow from the indigenous thinking of a book that I was reading earlier this year called Sand Talk by a gentleman called Tyson Yunker Porter. And he points out this really interesting complexity. Well, actually, I'm going to use that word. That if we actually embrace the complexity of our world, suddenly it gets simpler. But actually, in trying to make things simple, we miss a whole bunch of things and simultaneously make it more complicated for ourselves. So I think there's a different way of looking at the problem, and it is in trying to encourage, both in that systemic and the individual solution, something that is far more complex as your starting point.
And I would say also something.
Oh, please, go ahead.
Sure. I'd say also that I'm not convinced that the problem's been solved at all. I'm going to quote from a friend who was saying that he's living in Oakland and in California, where there's been a bunch of obviously a bunch of violence over Black Lives Matter. He said, my brother told me the other day someone was shot in Oakland for holding a Vote Trump sign. And I live here, and I told him I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. And he said, well, I guess we just can't know then. Like, we have this barrage of fake news, and even the idea of having objective truth around this stuff is being so undermined by not just Trump, but the way that social media creates these filter bubbles for each of us, that it means that we have no sense of shared narrative. I mean, this is, like, to use that term, like shared narrative of what's actually even happening in the world. I don't think this has been solved. YouTube banning anti-vaxxer videos doesn't remove the fact that we don't even know what's going on around the place. And this is only going to get worse. I mean, thankfully, Australia has been mostly insulated from this just by being a small country, but America is in real trouble at the moment. And like, to go back to something Melissa said, I really liked what you said earlier about the question of, who's in the room making these decisions. Like, I don't want my life to be ruled. I don't want the spaces that I live in to be ruled by some US corporations with whatever particular set of motives they happen to have. And I say this as someone who's lived over there for a couple of years and has great empathy for a lot of the people there, but they just simply don't speak for Australia and for Australian interests and for Australian community and culture and the way that we see the world. What I would like to see is us having more agency over the spaces that we actually live in. If I'm hanging out with my Australian friends here in Melbourne, we do improv classes together, and those communities are then moderated on Facebook. They exist on Facebook. So now the only way that I can interact with my own communities is via US corporations who are running a bunch of different algorithms to decide what content I'm going to see. I have no agency in expressing the way that I want those communities to operate, and I feel like we need to reclaim agency over that one way or another.
So if I can just chime in with, I agree with Melissa's assessment that it's about complexity, and I think this is a big part of it. That I think what we tend to do as humans is we love having black and white, good versus evil, and those dichotomies don't live in the real world. It is complex. The conversation should not be anti-tech or pro-tech. The conversation should be nuance. That's what's missing in the conversation, that this is complicated stuff. This isn't tech bad, tech good. That's a silly dichotomy. And I think that's what we need to bring back, is this realization of nuance is what we should be advocating for. And that, around the topic of fake news, I don't know what world ever has existed where there is a shared narrative, that truth is not just about the facts. Yuval Harari talks about how fake news is nothing new. We've had organized religion for millennia, right? Misinformation, disinformation, seeing the world differently, that's part of the human experience. It's never been just about facts. We arrive at the truth by debating the nature of reality. And so this is not a new phenomenon, people. Facebook did not create disagreement about the way the world works. And I think, in fact, if anything, I think, as Melissa said, that, we need, I think, if anything, we can harness these tools to help voice to help give voice to the voiceless. Now, there are all kinds of problems. It's an evolutionary process, but in many ways, I think it's arguable to think whether Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement could have possibly happened were it not for social media.
I'm just going to direct a question to Melissa. We used to be required to overcome some level of difference with our neighbors as we were more geographically constrained. Now we can find communities scattered all throughout the world. What do you think the impacts are of removing these geographical barriers?
I mean, I don't have a problem with it. I love it. I mean, social media enables me to stay connected to the communities that I deeply care about in Timor-Leste, in Palestine, in Australia, and in Europe, where all places I've lived in for extended periods of time. I also think it increases the awareness of what's going on in the world, and it gives us the ability to tap into whole different ways of thinking about the world. I mean, I particularly love it when I have a regular conversation with one of my Palestinian friends, and he speaks excellent English, but he speaks Arabic English, and I get an insight into his culture through the way that we communicate, and his outlook on the world is just, it's not that different, but it's also fundamentally different. And so I think in the removing of these geographic barriers, we have real opportunity if we can be humble to actually see that there's other schools of thinking, there are other ways of being in this world that can also help inform tech. And what I often find in the West, and when I come back to the West and I'm trying to work in the West, that there's this patronizing or this inferiorizing of other ways of being that appear much simpler, they're not ambitious and that sort of thing. And so I think there's an opportunity to embrace that. And so one of the, and for me, in becoming involved in Thinkers, one of the functions that we want to do is, like, when you hear a story that's on something from another part of the world, you actually will provide you with the immediate prompt for a link through to how that story is being talked about in that part of the world. Because how we talk about an issue is going to be very different to how they're talking about an issue. And so it's allowing people to act. I think that's nothing but a good thing. And we've always had this tendency to seek out community that fits what we are. And now that we have more opportunity to envisage what community is, that just becomes more complex. That's all. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah. And I want to, I agree with you. And I don't want to be, I don't think it's fair to characterize myself as anti-tech. I'm a software engineer. I think about this stuff a lot, and I have since I was a little kid. To me, the problem that I have is that I've seen healthy community on the internet, and I've been involved in healthy community on the internet. And then I've seen things that are incredibly unhealthy. And I really worry that the way that Facebook is designed and the way that Twitter shakes out, the way people actually interact on Twitter, is unhealthy for pretty much everybody involved and for society as a whole. So my question then, the way that what I'm asking and my framing is, how do we build technology that actually results in intimacy and connection, the kind of connection you're talking about, Melissa, where people can actually connect from other sides of the world, rather than the kind of community where, if I'm prone to a certain kind of thinking, I get sucked down a rabbit hole and end up on 4chan and flying to New Zealand and shooting some people because I get, because the worst parts of myself get amplified. And that's what I would like to see in the future internet, which I agree, Nia. I totally agree that it's really nuanced. And to be able to make the internet work better, it's going to absolutely involve engineers and technologists to be able to. We need people at Facebook, we need people at YouTube to make their products better. But right now, I don't think they're good enough. And right now, going back to Melissa's point, I don't think there's enough people in the room who need to be in the room because they're the part of the communities themselves that are being created in these spaces.
And I couldn't agree more. The solution is to build it, right? The solution is to screw Facebook. I don't have any. I mean, let's stop using Facebook, but let's do something better. If anything, what scares me is that the more we bash on Facebook and Twitter, the more people go somewhere, right? The cockroaches will go somewhere. They'll go to 4chan, they'll go to 8chan, they'll go to something even worse. They'll go to use forums that are even less oversight. At least on Facebook, there's certain content that they don't allow. Now Zuckerberg has said that Holocaust denial information will not be on Facebook. That, of course, the anti-vax stuff has been long gone. All kinds of stuff that now the algorithms can detect and take off Facebook. That stuff is not being removed from 4chan. That stuff is all over the internet in places that are much less regulated, not government regulated, but internal policy regulated. And so in many ways, we need to be careful what we're wishing for. If we are saying we don't want Facebook anymore, we damn well better have a better solution. But we need to build it, not regulate it.
And can I just say, I find myself agreeing with parts of what both of you are saying. But Seth, I couldn't agree more that we actually need to figure out there is something deeply problematic in social media and what it has the capacity to do. So on the one hand, I'm talking about how I suddenly have access to all these shared stories. But as I started out, I said I have family that have been in prison for their use of social media. And I personally have a much smaller digital footprint over the last few years because I don't want to be able to be tracked. This is really deeply problematic and it restricts as well. But I think you can't solve a problem with the same way of thinking, the same people who created the problem in the first place. So when we talk regulation, absolutely, we desperately need some kind of understanding of how to regulate power and control within the system. But we need to bring more people into the conversation in order to be able to get a solution. We have an opportunity to really have these conversations, and they aren't easy conversations. They are hard conversations that will force all of us to have a reckoning with what we think about things. And if we're prepared to sit in that discomfort, have these conversations. I know that's what me and my colleagues have been having. We've been having exactly these conversations amongst ourselves, trying to create something, but also really conscious that we need more diversity at the table to get something that looks like a solution to power and control, which is a big question.
I'm just going to put an open question out there, and anyone who feels like they want to chime in, go ahead. Many companies have teams that are dedicated to growth. Are our existing business models good enough? Do we need different ways to fund healthy technologies? We don't fund schools by advertising to students, so why should we do it online?
I really like that question. And yeah, I like a lot of what you said, Melissa. I don't think that we can solve the problems that we have online using the same tools of advertisement paid content. If I go out onto the street, I don't get giant billboards from companies that have funded the roads trying to advertise to me and trying to track me with every step that I take. We've decided collectively that we've got ways of collectively funding these things. And I don't even know if government is the right answer, but I think that we need some leadership. And leadership not from the perspective of playing whack-a-mole with different, awful groups that are showing up on Facebook, but instead leadership from the perspective of how do we construct spaces in which we can form community? How do we create schools? What should the constitution be? What kind of society, what sort of institutions do we want in these online spaces that are going to be able to invite more people into the room to be able to have an input on the way that the spaces themselves are created?
Melissa, did you want to? No. I think that the question comes from a particular bias that somehow competition is a bad thing, and I think I disagree with that. That I think that in fact schools advertising to gain students is a great thing. And as someone who's homeschooled our daughter for the past 6 years, I will tell you that in so many ways, the experience that my daughter has being homeschooled would not be possible were it not through companies that are for-profit ventures that have opened a world of opportunity to her, whether that's content that she's learning on YouTube that teaches her amazing things. And I don't know if any parents out there have poked around to see what kids are learning on YouTube. She's creating a YouTube channel. Not only did she learn how to code on YouTube, she's creating a YouTube channel now to teach other kids how to code. It's amazing. In that case, it's free for her. But there's also companies, for example, OutSchool, that's a for-profit school essentially that homeschoolers use, that gives kids access to some of the best experts in the world. The other day she read a murder mystery, a novel a murder mystery, and she said she had an interest in forensic anthropology. I don't even know what forensic anthropology was. And so we go on OutSchool and we type it in, and there's this former FBI agent who's retired, who lives in Wyoming, who teaches her a class where in Singapore he teaches a class here for her online. And so I think, were it not for these for-profit ventures who can improve upon old business models, things wouldn't get better. I think it's perfectly wonderful that companies can advertise and improve upon the last model using these amazing technologies. I think that's a great thing.
So, Nir, there's a quote from your book, Hooked, that 79% of smartphone owners check their phone within 15 minutes of waking up. Do you feel like this constant access to our social network is having any impact on the increasing rates of loneliness and that sort of thing? And is this something that we need to deal with?
Sure. I think if there's one motto that summarizes my work over the past 5 years in writing my book Indistractable, it's that the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. The antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. That, one thing that our species has that no other animal on the face of the earth has is the ability to see into the future with higher fidelity than any other animal. We can predict what is going to happen. And so if we leave these decisions to the last moment, we will lose. We know that willpower, that self-control does not work over the long term. That if you wait until the cigarette is in your hand, you're going to smoke it. If you wait till the chocolate cake is on the fork, you're going to eat it. If you sleep next to your cell phone, like 79% of smartphone owners, if you sleep next to it on your bedstand, you're going to pick it up first thing in the morning. They are going to get you. You have already lost. Our power, our agency, is to use forethought. There is no algorithm. There is no computer system that is going to make you do something you don't want to do if you think in advance how you would like to react in the moment. And so what becoming indistractable is all about is finding ways to prevent distraction by doing something today so that you don't do something you later regret tomorrow. And that is something that we have way more power than the tech companies, right? Simple things like, recently this whole debate around, the Social Dilemma movie and how powerless we all are. It reminds me, I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, Indiana Jones. Maybe you saw it when you were a kid. It's an old movie, but Indiana Jones, there's this scene in Indiana Jones where Indiana comes out, and he goes into the market, and there's this guy dressed in all black, and he has these swords, and he, does this whole routine with these swords, very intimidating, very scary. And then what does Indiana Jones do? He takes out his gun, and he just shoots him with one bullet. And I kind of feel that's what's going on today with social media, that we get so scared and worried about the algorithms and the computers at our brains and all this stuff, and we have the power. How about turning off those stupid notifications that constantly ping and ding you? How about uninstalling some of those apps? How about scheduling your day so that you know the difference between what is traction for your life and what is distraction in your life? These are some very simple steps that we can take today to make sure we don't get distracted in the future. And by the way, the problem is not just technology, right? The average American watches 6 hours of television a day, 6 hours. But we don't talk about these older technologies. We don't talk about the effect that all these other forms of media have, which, by the way, have the exact same business models, whether it's Rupert Murdoch's businesses, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's your local paper. It's all the same business model. They all want to monetize your attention. And we have to be aware of that. To get the good aspects of these technologies, while getting rid of the bad.
See, I think that's crap. Oh, sorry, Melissa, you wanted to jump in.
I mean, I was also going to say, not quite that strong, but yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's disputing that there's individual responsibility here and we have individual power. And I think we do absolutely have to have more of that conversation. At the same time, you do have tech companies, and it's the one space, I think this is actually some of Steph's thinking and some of what he's talked about here as well, but there's no other space where they have so much power and so much unregulated control over our lives. So yes, by all means, we can, take ownership of it, but it's sounding also a little bit like the environmental sector and the whole discussions around there. Just consume more, recycle everything, consume sustainable fabrics, buy better, be more conscious. And yet we're sitting at a moment in time where never has our consumption patterns been reduced on a global scale like it has right now. And it's had very little impact on the environment, which goes to show the power of these companies. Yes, we can be about the individual all we want, but there has to also be some regulation that sits on top of that. Plus, I will also say it's an absolute privilege to be able to take that individual control over something. Some people do not have the privilege to do that. Some people have no option but to, it's the only way to communicate. And I say that in America and in Australia, we have ways of communicating with each other. But in places like Timor, the entire social network is Facebook. India, as I understand it, everyone has access to Facebook. They may not have even a phone number that they can call someone on because they can't pay for the credit, but the phone company gives them access to Facebook. And that happens in Timor, that happens in Palestine as well. And so it's great for us to sit here and say individual responsibility, but there also has to be corporate responsibility, and we have to hold corporates to account for that.
And just to be clear, to respond to that, I'm not saying there is no room for regulation. I think there is room for regulation. I think there are many issues, political regulation, interference in terms of elections. Absolutely, these companies have responsibility. Monopoly status, there's definitely some questions there. Data incursion, lots of questions. I'll tell you what will not be regulated away. We will not regulate the fact that a company's product is engaging. Right? Netflix, can you please make your movies more boring? I like to watch them. Apple, your phones are far too user-friendly. Please make them more difficult to use. Never going to happen. We don't want that to happen. That's not a problem. That's progress. This is not an issue of privilege. Quite the opposite. It's wonderful for people to use these devices. It doesn't require privilege or money to turn off notification settings.
I couldn't disagree more. I mean,
I'm just going to have to, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd just like to ask Nir if there are any takeaways about...
Sorry, can I jump in this for like a minute before we do that? Sorry. This is the same as cigarettes. It's the same as gambling. We don't say that, oh, well, the solution to cigarettes is that you should just have self-control. Everyone just needs self-control, but we'll advertise the crap out of them. No, we regulated the advertising of cigarettes. We looked at gambling, and it's not like, oh, gambling's totally fine for everybody at every age group, right? We've got, 189% increase in hospitality rate amongst girls from the age of 10 to 14. Why? Because they can't switch off. They don't have the self-control to be able to do it. This is not something that we can solve at an individual level entirely. We need to be, like, these companies, you say the word engagement, I'm hearing addiction, right? It's totally fine. We're never going to have any regulations to say that addictive qualities are going to be bad and not something we want. Addiction is not the same as desire. I do not want to, you can do studies. I've seen studies. Addiction, if something's addictive, is Twitter good? Do I enjoy going on Twitter? No, I find it addictive. That's why I'm on it, right? So insofar as we shouldn't regulate this stuff, we absolutely should regulate it too, because it's really causing real issues in society, and it's not okay.
So
sorry, James.
I agree with you that there are protected classes. Absolutely. There's lots of things that we don't let children do. I wouldn't let my 12-year-old daughter walk into a bar and order a gin and tonic. She's not ready for it. I wouldn't let her go into a casino and play blackjack. She's not ready for it.
It's so engaging. What's the problem?
Because she's not ready to slam down a beer at 12 years old. That's why. So we have certain laws, and the minimum age to use social media is 13. Now, should these companies do something about this? to make it harder for kids to go on these products? Absolutely. But should parents stop using their iPads as iNannies? Of course, give me a break. Are we going to just say, let's wait for the government to fix this problem, when meanwhile parents haven't even checked to see if their kids are using a device and a product that the company manufacturing the product says do not let your kid use before the age of 13? There has to be a personal responsibility element. The companies are telling you don't let your kids use the product. So we have to take steps ourselves. So that is a protected class of people, and I am all for regulation to protect children. Absolutely. There's another class of protected people that I have written about for years and advocated for and met with every single one of these companies, and I agree with you, requires regulation, which is for pathological addicts, okay? There is a classification of people who have this disease. This is not, we have to stop using this term addiction as if everybody's got it. It is disrespectful to people who actually have this disease of addiction. But if a person is struggling from addiction and they do not have the sound body and mind to make these decisions, it is unethical, if they want to stop, to keep them on the product. And so I agree, this is a place where we do have room for regulation. I've advocated for the past 6 years for what I call a use and abuse policy. That unlike an alcohol manufacturer that doesn't know who is consuming and who the alcoholics are, they don't know, they can't do anything about it. I absolutely agree with you, Seth. These companies know who is abusing the product, and they could step in and say, hey, look, we have seen that you are using Facebook or a game 20 hours, 30 hours a week. Can we help? Can we do something to help you moderate your use? That is something that I advocate for, and I think there is room for regulation. But for the vast majority of us who are not addicted, it's up to us, right? If you're not a child, if you're not pathologically addicted, guess what? We have to do something about the problem.
James, I'm just going to have to stop here to go into some questions because we're going a bit over time. But so Theron asks, perhaps the question is, why have we set up a society with unhealthy options for the environment as opposed to focusing on human well-being?
I'll let somebody else take it. Not too much.
I would challenge this notion that we've set it up. I think it's always been this way, frankly, and we have to have really honest conversations with ourselves about where are our priorities and what is and whose human well-being are we talking? Because usually when we have these conversations, it's only the people at the table who we're actually genuinely thinking about and understanding. So I think when we're talking about any of these conversations, something just feels like it's missing from the discourse, and that's what I keep saying, which is other narratives, other humanity, other ways of being in this world, because it's so central to everyone's lives, no matter where you are. Tech is affecting people's lives, and some of the issues, they're real, but they're also narrow. So we have to have, as a society, we have to be better able to understand someone else's humanity and understand that we all have biases and perspectives that we bring to the table, that everything we consume brings to the table. And if we can have that starting point, we might actually get further in some of these conversations as well.
LF says, great point on individual agency, but is that assuming that individuals have the same power as companies with thousands of engineers working to keep us hooked? Might I add, the world's most powerful supercomputers?
Yeah, I think this is the narrative that is really dangerous, that is promoted by, that's exactly lifted from the Social Dilemma movie and the words of Tristan Harris. And I think it is really hurting people because the solutions are quite simple. The solutions, as I outlined, I was interviewed for the Social Dilemma movie. I sat down with them for 3 hours and told them all the things that we can do. And none of my commentary, as well as none of the commentary from dozens of academics that they interviewed that disagreed with this narrative, were included in the movie. Because people don't like this idea that there's something they can do about the problem. We would much rather have a big bad company pushing us and making us do things, as opposed to assuming some personal responsibility and realizing it isn't that hard. We're not injecting Instagram. We're not freebasing Facebook. We're not snorting Snapchat, for God's sakes. These are apps, people. It's not that difficult. There are some things we can do that Mark Zuckerberg can't come into our phone and undo those settings. We just need to believe we can do something. We know the number one determinant of whether an alcoholic is able to stay sober after rehab. You know what the number one determinant? It is not the level of physical dependency. The number one determinant, according to studies, is their belief in their own power to change. So when we promote this ridiculous narrative that we're addicted, that we're being hijacked, that there's nothing we can do about it, it leads to what's called learned helplessness. People stop trying when they believe there's nothing they can do.
And can I just play off that? I think that's a discourse that's happening broader than just tech, right? It's happening in politics, and people and across the working class and across different communities. I know in the US it's African American communities, Hispanic communities, and saying, actually, you have the right to vote. And in democracy, if we all got together and we all built networks together, we would be able to challenge that power. And so actually, I think there's a real opportunity in these conversations to actually go out to movements and organisers and community organisers at those grassroots and talk and engage at that level and say, you've been doing this for decades, trying to get people mobilised and politically active and exercising their right to vote. There's so much you can learn there that is exactly transferable, virtually exactly transferable into this space and these conversations, because it's about power, but it's about getting individuals to mobilise and understand they have the power to demand that accountability.
But only so much power. And this is my concern with all of this, that so long as Facebook and Twitter and so on is the public square, then I don't get to vote on the policies that Twitter has in place. I don't get to vote on the policies Facebook has in place. I don't get to vote on which algorithm Facebook uses to be able to decide what comes up on my newsfeed. And that's a thing that I absolutely should have autonomy over, and individuals should have autonomy over. For all this talk of individual liberty, we don't have a huge amount of individual liberty when it comes to our communities being on Facebook and deciding the ways in which Facebook treats us as users. This is something that we need much better tools around. And I think the answer is more technology, not less. I totally agree with that. But I don't think the narrative that Facebook is trying to hijack our minds is dangerous to anyone except for Facebook. It's true, right? It's true that that's what they're trying to do. This is what the word engagement means, right? If you're optimizing for engagement, you're optimizing for users.
It's the opposite, actually. That the tech companies, in fact, want you to believe you're powerless. They love this narrative that Seth, you're promoting, and people like Tristan Harris are promoting, that there's nothing you can do, because they realize that when they convince people that they're powerless, they don't do anything to change, right? We know these companies are hacking our attention, just as Rupert Murdoch is hacking your attention, just as every media company is hacking your attention. Of course they are. But here's the thing. Who says we can't hack back? We absolutely can hack back. Exactly as you said, we use new technology to change the old generation of technology. Facebook Newsfeed Eradicator, a free Chrome extension that takes out the entire Facebook newsfeed, so you don't have to see that crap anymore. YouTube DF, I talked about earlier, so you don't have to see the stuff that you don't want to see. It takes out all the ads for you. Totally free technology. Anyone can use, regardless of privilege, race, color, creed, or economic status. We can all use these free tools to hack back, as long as we believe there's something we can do about it.
Okay, I'm going to have to wrap up here, but I'd like to give a warm thank you to the panelists, Nia, Melissa, and Seth. It's been a really excellent conversation. Everyone involved in the organization of Spark Festival, Adriana from Prismatic, and a special thanks to the Center of Humane Technology for inspiring this entire event. You can find us at www.humanetechnology.com.au. We also have a Twitter and a Facebook, which is Humane Tech AU. And if you'd like to reach out to me directly, it's at james@humanetechnology.com.au. Is there anything that any of the panelists would like to plug, like, Thinker or Near and Far, or I don't know?
I just want to say thank you. This is a genuinely engaging discussion. These are all discussions I've been having with my co-founders around thinkers and trying to think about ways that we can live in this complexity, because this has been quite a complex discussion. So yeah, thinkers, we're brand spanking new. Thinkers, it's thinkers without the E, .co.
For all our disagreement, I really like what Nia just said, that I think that we've got a lot of agency, and it's very important we step into that and we build better technology to be able to have the kinds of communities that we want to have.
Yes, and thank you. I know sometimes I get heated, and I'm very passionate about this topic because it's something I've sat in for many years, and I really, I think the thing that binds us all together is that we all believe in the future of humanity, and we want the best for our kind, and so I think the global humanity, and I think as long as we can support that, as long as we can help people meet their be their greatest possible self, that's what we're all here to do. And we all agree that there is opportunity here ahead of us. And so it was a pleasure, even despite our disagreement. I think there's a lot more we agree upon than that we disagree upon. And in terms of my website, if anybody's interested to learn more about my work, it's at nirandfar.com, but Nir is spelled like my first name. So it's NIR and far.com.